If you imagine that pastors' knees get weak at the thought of preaching Easter, you would be absolutely right. Any of us who has good sense will admit to some fear and trembling as this day approaches. Perhaps we are like those who arrived at the tomb and found it empty. But our weak-kneed approach probably has as much to do with the cultural and religious and emotional baggage that we carry and which all of you bring into the sanctuary on this most glorious of days. It has as much to do with that as it does with the difficulty of preaching resurrection. And either way, let's face it, there's a lot riding on this Sunday. But here we are, and it's Easter. And in Christian churches everywhere, the sanctuary is usually full, as it is this morning. And whether you are here for the first time in a long time, or you are here for the first time since Christmas, or you are here for the first time in your life, you are here at the right time. Whether you are a long-time faithful every Sunday member, or you are an occasional visitor, you have come to church at the right time. We are very glad to see all of you this morning. Welcome to worship. Perhaps like some of you, I grew up in a family that celebrated Easter with the Easter Bunny. Easter was about dozens and dozens of eggs dyed and decorated for the annual Easter egg hunt in my Aunt Ruth's garden. Eggs hidden under lilac bushes and in between the rows of corn, behind the early sweet peas, in the chicken house. It was about baby chicks. We had 100 of them every year in the chicken house. It was about baby ducks. We had one that grew up to terrorize neighborhood children. And it was about bunnies, especially the one that was slipped in the back door of our house by an uncle one Easter morning before dawn, to the later dismay of my mother, who got up to find this beautiful white rabbit hopping around the living room, leaving little souvenirs with each bounce. Easter was a table extended from the dining room into the living room, set for 20 or more, with the traditional Easter menu of baked ham and fried chicken and scalloped potatoes, spiced apples, relish trays, lemon meringue pies. Easter was one of my favorite holidays. But there was never any mention of Jesus or a cross, no mention of an empty tomb or resurrection. None of those words or images was ever part of my Easter until Grace Memorial Church was built on the corner. We must have been every pastor's dream. A new church built in the 1950s, the golden years for mainline Protestant churches, in a neighborhood where 90% of the homes had children in them, and 90% of those children walked down the block to Sunday school at Grace Memorial Church. It was there in the basement Sunday school rooms of that non-denominational brick church on the corner that I first heard stories about Jesus, that I memorized Bible verses, and I won gold stars for attendance. It was where I got my 4th grade Bible with my name embossed on the cover in gold letters. Back then, I have to say, some of the stories seemed a little far-fetched, especially that whole resurrection thing. But I loved Easter anyway, especially when we got to sing, "Up from the grave he arose." I almost put that in this morning. But this morning, the account of that first Easter daybreak is from the Gospel of Mark. And it's the Gospel that doesn't give us much to hold on to. It is similar to other Gospels in that there are women at the tomb, the stone has been rolled away, and there is no sign of a body. But in Mark, there is no running back to the other disciples to tell them the good news. There is no appearance of a gardener or neatly folded burial cloths. There is no encounter on the road to Emmaus. Jesus isn't among the disciples eating fish and bread on the beach. There is no sudden appearance in an upper room. If we go with what is believed by most scholars to be the original ending, as we did this morning, there is just an empty tomb. And as writer and preacher Fred Craddock is quick to remind us, an empty tomb in and of itself does not present a persuasive argument for the resurrection. An empty tomb means the body is not there. We all have an image of what resurrection might have looked like, On the one hand, maybe we would like Easter to look like the old paintings of the risen Christ floating above the empty tomb, dressed in white flowing robes, clean and neat and healed, and clearly on his way heavenward, his feet in the clouds. Outwardly, that's how we come to Easter Sunday, cleaned up in our Easter finery, our children scrubbed and ruffled, grandparents by our side, the ham in the oven at home, your home perhaps, not mine, a Norman Rockwell Easter Sunday morning. Or perhaps your image of resurrection is more like the latest revival of Jesus Christ Superstar on Broadway, the closing moments of which were described by one reviewer this way. The actor portraying Jesus strikes the pose immortalized in centuries of art, clad in a demure loincloth, arms held out to his side, one leg artfully bent in front of the other, head hanging down in tortured exhaustion. Gently spotlighted, he rises from the stage as if by magic, while a giant cross, pulsing with hot gold lights, descends from above to meet him. The reality of resurrection might have been closer to the description I read of another artist's rendering of the event, in which the writer says this about the painting. In it, a gaunt, wounded man stumbled from the black mouth of his grave, wearing nothing but a strip of linen around his loins. His bare feet were on the ground. His hurt places looked like they still hurt. He clearly needed something to eat, but there was such a look of stunned triumph on his face that I had no doubt he would live. I also had no doubt that he had been dead. He had returned from someplace so far and beyond this world that only God could have brought him back. It was not a rescue, it was a resurrection, and he looked like it had cost him plenty. We don't know, of course, what it really looked like. No one does, because while the crucifixion was a public event, the resurrection was a rather more private affair. Like the first followers, we were not invited to the resurrection. All we've ever been given to consider are an open grave and some linen burial cloths lying around, and reports of post-resurrection appearances. In some ways, the writer of Mark got it right with the original ending, where the women flee in fear and tell no one what they've encountered at the tomb. What we do know is that something happened and continues to happen, or we wouldn't be talking about it. Whatever happened remains a mystery, and sometimes it's just best to report what we know and trust the mystery of what happened between heaven and earth that morning. As one preacher put it, not every mystery, after all, is meant to be solved. The best mysteries are simply meant to be loved, for the heart is able to love the mysteries that the mind can never solve. Perhaps like the women at the tomb in the Gospel of Mark, we are simply afraid to imagine or believe resurrection. I sometimes wonder if we imagine resuscitation instead. Resuscitation looks like Lazarus staggering out of the tomb, still wrapped in burial cloths, with the stench of 3 days' worth of death on him. Resuscitation looks like an episode from Grey's Anatomy that may or may not have a happy ending. Resuscitation is not always possible, but resuscitation is not resurrection. And thankfully, we're not promised resuscitation. If we were, we would simply carry on where we left off. Resuscitation involves a once dead person coming back to life and resuming more or less ordinary existence until he or she dies again. Resurrection means something quite different, and maybe that's the scary part. Resurrection, after all, means radical change. I'm the first to admit that resurrection moments seem far and few between these days. You don't have to go very far or very deep to find evidence of a world desperately in need of resurrection, which often seems unimaginable, not to mention unbelievable, certainly unattainable. Maybe it's not about imagining or even believing the resurrection as much as it is about living the resurrection. And before we can live the resurrection, we have to know what it looks like from the inside out. So I want to tell you what I think resurrection looks like. A number of years ago now, I had the privilege of traveling to Russia as part of a study group on Russian Orthodoxy. We went by boat from St. Petersburg to Moscow, stopping every day to visit another monastery, another museum, another seminary, another church. For a child of the 1950s growing up in America, it was an eye-opening journey for me, because I grew up being told that the Russians were a godless people, that they had no faith, no religion, and certainly no church. As a consequence, I had always imagined all of Russia, or the Soviet Union in those days, to be a sea of gray cinder block and steel buildings. If it wasn't covered in snow, it was always rainy and cold in my imagination. If you haven't had the opportunity to go to Russia, let me tell you that Moscow in May is nothing like what I had imagined my whole life. The city is ablaze with color, from the government buildings to the churches, from the flower gardens and public parks to the icons on church walls. It takes your breath away. St. Basil's in Red Square looks exactly like it does in the pictures, with the onion domes brightly colored and striped, that brilliant blue with dazzling gold stars and gold crosses on top. But back to my resurrection story. We arrived in St. Petersburg on a Saturday evening, and on Sunday morning, being a study group of Russian Orthodoxy, we went to church. The church was full. And since there are no pews or places to sit, you could say it was standing room only, and there wasn't much of that. All of us were practically shoulder to shoulder. Everybody, from the youngest children to the most elderly worshipers, everybody stands for the whole service, which can sometimes go on for 3 or more hours. It was the third Sunday in Eastertide for the Eastern Orthodox churches, and part of the Eastertide celebration included a procession around the church. Because we were guests of the bishop, our group was invited to be at the front of the procession along with the children, who were dressed in red and gold brocade capes and carrying candles. And we too were given candles to carry, and as we fell in line behind the children, the entire congregation followed. The priests led the way. They were carrying the icons, the cross, and the Bible, all of which we could identify. But we were most intrigued by the one who was carrying a very large bowl of water and something that looked like a giant wooden whisk with curls of wood, like curled ribbons at the end of the handle. Russian Orthodox churches are built in the shape of a cross, so the procession marched out the front door and around to the side of the church that would be one arm of the cross. The priests sang for a while, and then one of them shouted, "Christos voskres," Christ is risen. And the congregation responded loudly and joyfully, "Voistinu voskres," risen indeed, 3 times. And each time the priest dipped the wooden whisk in the water and showered all of us in what was clearly a remembrance of our baptism. The procession began again, and we moved to the head of the cross, and the same ritual was repeated 3 times. Christos voskres, Christ is risen. Voistinu voskres, risen indeed. And more water came down on all of us. We rounded the corner again to the other arm of the cross, and this time the priest who had the honor of proclaiming the resurrection picked up the wooden whisk, looked at our group, and said to us in English, "Christ is risen." And we responded, "Risen indeed." 3 times, and 3 more times, we were reminded of our baptism in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. During the Bolshevik Revolution, hundreds, perhaps thousands of priests were killed or exiled. Thousands of churches were closed or turned into museums or government buildings. And only 3 seminaries survived, mostly as empty buildings or residences for the handful of priests who were left. Church bells were silenced for the next 70 years. Some were destroyed, some were used for armament. In 1939, when the war began, some restrictions were lifted, and the Soviets allowed the election of a new patriarch and the reopening of some of the churches, but only to those who were loyal to the Communist Party. The state clamped down again on religious practices during the Cold War under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and it continued that way until 1990, when a law was passed allowing religious freedom, and the church began to emerge from the shadows. Somehow the church survived. Today there are 57 seminaries, and all of them have waiting lists. 15,000 churches have been rebuilt or restored, and the bells ring out every Sunday. thanks to a handful of people who kept the music alive. You know that iconography is central to the Russian Orthodox faith. Russians will tell you that icons are the windows into heaven, and the bells are the voice of God. That Sunday morning in Eastertide, the faces of those standing with us proclaiming resurrection were the icons, the windows into heaven for me, the voice of God in my ears. That's what resurrection looks like. That's what it means to live the resurrection. It's not always that dramatic, of course. In fact, rarely that dramatic. So if we're going to live resurrection, maybe one of the ways to do it is to practice on the resurrection moments that are part of our day-to-day life as Easter people. So if you're still having trouble imagining resurrection, think about this. If you have ever come through a dark night of the soul and made it to the light at the end of the tunnel, you know what resurrection looks like. If you have ever fallen into the despair of addiction and you are still in recovery, you know what resurrection looks like. If you have ever stepped away from an abusive relationship and recovered yourself as a beloved child of God, you know what resurrection looks like. If you have ever faced into the fear of a devastating illness and somehow found the courage and the resolve to get through it, you know what resurrection looks like. And you are living the resurrection. Here's the catch. Resurrection means transformation. And we have to want it badly enough to set aside the truth of our past and live into the hope of a resurrection future day after day. And it's hard work. It's coming face to face with a risen Christ who says, I'm going to God and I'm taking you with me. It's Easter, and it's still Easter bonnets and Easter baskets, Easter bunnies and Easter brunch. But because we know what resurrection looks like, we have no choice but to proclaim our experience of the living Christ. We have no choice but to live resurrection. On this glorious Easter day, may it be so. Thanks be to God. Happy Easter.